like determinism. They like, if I call this function, it's going to do a thing. If I don't call the function, it's not going to do the thing or whatever, right? So that's a big challenge, and I think that's part of what your all toolchain is meant to do. Now, just because you've been on the show a couple times, there's probably still people out there who don't know who you are, and your role has changed a little bit. How about a quick introduction into yourself again and what you're doing these days? I know you made a career transition recently.
Yeah. So my name is Sydney. Nice to meet folks. I am a passionate open source developer. And so on previous episodes, I was on talking about Pydantic and doing kind of open source maintenance there. So Pydantic is both an open source tool, and now there's a company built around that open source tool. And I recently switched over to LangChain. Excited to be working with an open source team in person in Boston. So that's quite exciting. And I'm mostly working on maintaining LangGraph now. So many folks are probably familiar with LangChain, the open source package. We'll probably get into that a little bit more soon. But LangGraph is kind of our newer agent orchestration framework. Other than that, yeah, I love just engaging with folks in the open source community, getting excited about building, cooler AI applications now. And I don't know, in my free time, I'm quite the podcast addict. So it's always nice to listen to your other podcasts.
Oh, thank you. Well, I know you worked on some cool projects, and this certainly is another one of them. I didn't realize they were based in Boston. That's cool.
Yeah, so the main office is actually in San Francisco, but the company's growing pretty fast. So we now have a Boston office as of last week. So got my nice little call booth background here, and then a New York office as well.
Mm-hmm. Is it off that 128 highway there where a lot of the tech companies are?
I'm actually not super familiar with San Francisco geography, but
No, I'm thinking Boston, up by like Woburn.
Gotcha. Yeah, we're actually in Harvard Square.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah, proper Boston.
Yes.
Not Boston suburbs, where a lot of those companies are out there.
Yep.
Yeah, really cool. So let's just start by talking about AI a little bit. I know some people are AI accelerists, or people who believe that AI should be just pushed as fast as it can be, and I suspect a lot of folks like that can be found at LangChain. Also, people can be very hesitant to it, right? I know some people are like, I'm not using it, I won't use it. I'm not sending my data to the big cloud companies or whatever to train their models to take my job, or however people perceive this. I'm certainly pretty. I see a ton of value in it. I think it's really quite incredible. But what are your thoughts on kind of using LLMs in general, and then two, what is an agent?
Yeah, great question. So I think I definitely fall more on the accelerator side of things, but with guardrails and constraints and rules and boundaries, which is sort of what we're trying to do with LangGraph. I think it can be really helpful as to use LLMs as a development tool. So I personally do that when I'm writing code. I also think it's really helpful to brainstorm with the help of LLMs, and so I think they're increasingly valuable, and as long as we're being careful about usage, then it's great to kind of lean into their strengths.
Reuven Lerner, I just had him on the show a couple episodes ago, and he says he uses the reverse Socratic method with LLMs, where he writes the code, then he asks it to he sort of interrogates it, like, well, what's wrong with my code? What could be better? When would I use it? And what am I overlooking? And there's so many uses. It's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think, sometimes I'll talk to my parents and be like, oh, I used ChatGPT to help me come up with a recipe. And they're like, you did what? I didn't even know you could do that. Whereas, folks at work are having, interacting with AI on the hour. So, so I'll talk a little bit more about what are our agents. Agents are a little bit hard to define. I think it's kind of an overloaded term, but many people are kind of leading into that as the future of AI from a developer perspective. So I think about agents as, tools that can reason and make decisions for you specifically, LLMs that are powered with things like tool calling and memory and context and things like that. So it's basically a like super powered LLM. Like you're jumping from a simple like chat based model for an LLM to how can you use an LLM in an application. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it can call tools like you could give it a request and maybe it's going to go and do like web searches or read web pages, or you can tell it go read the docs and then do this thing or something along those lines.
Right. So, LLMs are trained on older data. And so if you're not enabling your LLMs to use kind of real world data and information, then their utility is limited. But agents have the power to, use tools, which are basically like API calls, or it can even be more simple than that, like running some code in order to incorporate your like real time relevant data.
Yeah.
And it can also kind of make decisions about like which tools do I want to use and that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I guess it's related to deep research a little bit, right? Like a lot of the deep research things seem to be kind of using tools and using the modern web and other stuff that they can find rather than just whatever the model was when it was constructed.
Yeah, definitely. I think about like Perplexity is kind of gaining in popularity, and it's really good at you can ask it a question and then it does real time research against like looking things up on the internet and then provides you back with citations, which is a really exciting feature I think for folks who are like LLMs can just make anything up. Like how do I know this is being pulled from reasonable sources? And that's kind of an exciting jump in that space.
It is, and I think it also goes a little ways, not that far, but a little ways to fill that gap where people said, these search engines, they just take our data and they give us no credit, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm sympathetic to. However, I do think it says, here's the 4 places I found, and here's the video you should watch if you want to go deeper. I think that's actually super valuable. I just asked Perplexity a historical question, like, what is the age of these people who did this thing, hundreds of years ago? And it said in their work, and it wrote Python code, and then it gave me the answer. It was probably doing, I think it was doing, pandas type stuff, but it was sitting there thinking, and it shows you what it's doing. It just says writing Python, and then boom, out comes the answer. I'm like, okay, that's weird.
Oh man, was it correct?
Yeah, it was correct, I think.
Wow.
Wild. Yeah. But that's kind of the stuff we're talking about a little bit, right? In this agentic sense. It's not just like, well, I went to my database, these are answers I have. But it's like, well, if I can make this web query and I could write some pandas, then I could format it the way you asked for it, right?
Yeah. There's definitely a lot more kind of reasoning and thinking. It is a bit of a black box right behind like what is the LLM doing? And so you got a bit of transparency there with the like writing Python code clue, but yeah.
I wish there was a view source. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we're trying to do at LangChain right now with LangGraph development is to kind of bridge the gap between like what are the parts of your system that you really need to like understand and kind of be guaranteed are reliable and will always run in the same way versus like where can you afford to introduce non-determinism in favor of like a bit more maybe agency or utility, but also introducing risk. Like who knows what your LLM was doing in the research phase.
Yeah. It's just so powerful, but it's also so scary as a developer to think, I can't debug this. I can't prove that it's going to do the right thing all the time, right? And I guess it really depends, right? Like Siri, for example, on the iPhone, sorry if that made anybody's phones go off. It's so bad. It's just so weirdly not capable of doing stuff. And you know that if that were backed by an LLM instead, sure, it might make mistakes periodically, but as a net, it would be so much better that it's probably worth it. You know what I mean? Yeah. On the other hand, you wouldn't want to say, I'm going to create an agentic workflow to determine if you get a mortgage or things like that would be a little bit too much, I think, right? It would deny people for weird random reasons and
Right. You definitely have to
wouldn't be good.
consider the, stakes and risk and value of a decision that you're making, right? And like, I think generally I wouldn't empower LLMs to make like the most important decisions in my life on a day-to-day basis. But like you said, I do find myself like, laughing at Siri's responses more than actually like valuing the response. So
It's incredible at setting timers and, telling you what the temperature is, but boy, you vary off very much. No, it doesn't. It just doesn't do it. Okay. So when would you use, I mean, I talked about examples you wouldn't use it. Give us examples of when you might really embrace these things.
yeah. So I think, we talk a little bit about we've talked about the non-determinism of LLM behavior, right? But also kind of the power of an agent is in making decisions for you. And if you can give your large language model the appropriate context and descriptions of tools so that it can do a good job making decisions for you, then that can save you a lot of time. So one classic example I'll probably touch on a couple times today is you might build an email agent. And so the value of that email agent, right, is that it can categorize emails for you. Maybe some things are spam, some things need immediate response, some things can even be automatically responded to. And then said agent could learn from your preferences over time. So maybe before an automatic reply is sent out, you, the user, get to like approve that reply, but you didn't have to do all the work of drafting and that sort of thing. And so I think the greatest value that I see in developing workflows with agents is if you can come up with systems that we call like ambient workflows. Basically, instead of responding to some user prompt like, hey, what's the weather? They're running in response to external triggers. So in this example, like the email that you received. And so basically you're trying to create a system that does work and automates work for you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Could determine if is this an emergency? Is this something, a tech support type thing? Is it an accounting thing? And then it could just, maybe do a little bit of work through your docs, give a response, and then forward it to the right person or something like that, right?
Right, exactly. I think we think about like chatbots on, like websites that help users as another common example. And, when you're talking with the chatbot, at what point does it decide like, what, we need to escalate this and like actually, provide them with a phone number to call with a real person or that sort of thing.
Right. Awesome. I definitely see this as being one of the more powerful and more common ways that LLMs actually interact with people. I mean, it's kind of weird that it's a chat. You know what I mean? It is pretty useful, but it's also just weird that it's like, okay, we're gonna just have this chat with this thing, whereas it could do so much more.
Yeah, you mean with the like chatbot example, like on a
Yeah.
help page?
Or
Yeah.
exactly. Or even ChatGPT itself or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's kind of why we're so excited about the like ambient or like background system pattern. Is like a chat is super helpful if I'm like, I have these 5 ingredients in my fridge. Like, what should I make for dinner? That's like a very simplistic pattern, and we think you should kind of build a system that is only as simple as you need. But then I think the real value comes when you're responding to those external like real-time triggers.
Can one of them be like a cron job? Like every hour check this stock price, or every hour evaluate the sentiment of this community, and then
Yeah.
do something.
Yeah, definitely. I think as we get more into discussing how you can build workflows with LangGraph, it'll become pretty evident how you can like schedule things, and that's like a very predictable pattern, right? And then
Right. Okay.
maybe is useful for you. I can imagine for the case where you're like running something on a schedule, the end result might be like, okay, you've analyzed sentiment. Do I need to like send an alert to my user or things like that?
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, let's talk a bit about, I guess, LangChain first. So there's a lot of things going on here, right? There's LangChain, the company. There's LangChain, the open source project. There's LangGraph. Tell us about all these things.
Yeah. So happy to give kind of an overview. So LangChain, the open source tool, is basically a tool for developers to use LLMs and really increase the value of LLMs, or kind of augment the power of LLMs with your data. And so some of the things that we've built in LangChain include like abstractions around chat models. So you can decide you're going to use, the 4.1 model, and you want to use different settings, like maybe set the temperature to 0, or only send some maximum number of tokens or things like that. And then specifically, a lot of the value from LangChain, the open source tool, comes from introducing this like model agnostic interface. So if I want to chain a bunch of like model responses together, it's kind of hard to do that if I am like separately querying the OpenAI API and then the Anthropic API, and then trying to work with Gemini as well. There are kind of different response formats and features, etc. And so LangChain makes it really easy for developers to use all of those different model providers in a single application.
That's interesting. So if I wanted, I could bring my own LLM. Is that possible?
Yes. Yep.
Right. Like I could use Olama or LM Studio or one of those things rather than the full cloud version.
Yes. Yep. Definitely. Which is nice just from an extensibility point of view. And then, if you want to use that LLM and then start to use some other more commercially available ones as well, you can combine those. And so the, name LangChain comes together when we think about chains of systems. One common example that we use is RAG, right? So you, have your vector store, some user asks a question, and you fetch the relevant data from the vector store, and then you kind of feed that into the LLM. And so that was a very common pattern like folks, LangChain users would implement.
Okay. Yeah, very cool. And then LangGraph. LangGraph is more about building workflows out of this, right?
Yes. So LangGraph is kind of the evolution of LangChain, and it has two main things that we focus on. So it's got a low-level system for building graphs. So you can think of that, the very like computer science folks will be excited to hear the terms like nodes and edges, right? You're building this low-level system. You can control the flow of data, or the flow of your application. You can have conditional branches. You can run nodes in parallel. All of those kind of exciting graph features. And then we also have, and you can see here, what we call pre-builds, which help you build agents on top of that graph framework. So the promise of LangGraph is that it's extensible because we have those low-level building blocks, but then also very easy to get started with an agent application.
Yeah, like one of the examples you have on the GitHub page is create React agent from the pre-built graphs. Is that React as in JavaScript's React framework, or just a reactive thing?
Good question. So that's React is kind of a common term in the agent building space. So it's reasoning and action agent.
I see. So it has nothing to do with JavaScript necessarily.
No, it does not. We actually will be probably changing this name soon to just create agent, to be a little bit more clear for folks.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, super cool. So I guess give us a sense of maybe. Well, let me circle back to some stuff you talked about. Then I want to talk about why not just call OpenAI or something like that. It's API directly. But you mentioned tokens and what was the other thing?
I think I mentioned temperature.
Temperature, that was the one. Yes, thank you. Temperature. So LLMs can have a certain amount of creativity is maybe the right word, but not really. a certain amount of flexibility in, I guess, almost randomness in the amount of the way that it works its way through finding the answers. In the higher the temperature, the more you let it be creative and wonder, whereas the lower the temperature, you're like, no, just give me the closest answer with the least amount of variability.
Yep.
I imagine that is really an important consideration in building these types of things because it probably significantly influences how deterministic a thing is.
Yeah. I think a great way to think about it is if your temperature is low, let's say we're going on a scale of like 0 to 1. So if your temperature is like 0 to 0.3, it's, more deterministic. We can't say like guaranteed to be fully deterministic, but I think, when you're building a system that's going to be deployed for users or basically a production ready system, you're certainly going to lean on the side of lower temperature. But for more creative applications, it's nice to have that setting be pretty configurable just so you can, really see what kind of ideas your LLM can help you with.
Right. I wanted you to help me think creatively about doing this thing and what are my options, right? Like that kind of thing. You probably don't want to set temperature to 0, but when you're building workflows, I imagine it's usually more tending lower.
Yep, definitely. Sort of a like silly example of maybe when you would set the temperature to higher is I was doing some shopping this weekend and stumbled upon a listing on Facebook Marketplace, and the listing had a riddle as the description, and it was like, if you solve this riddle, you can have this bedside table for free. And so, plugging the riddle into ChatGPT with a higher temperature might be more valuable there. Obviously, more of a toy example, but kind of shows the utility there.
Yeah, I've been doing a bunch of stuff on Facebook Marketplace. That is a crazy place.
Yes,
it's the new Craigslist. It's really weird.
Yeah, indeed.
But that's a wild example. And the other one that I think is probably important to define would be just tokens, because a lot of the models, especially the local models, I don't want to send my data off. I want to run Olam or I want to run LM Studio. Those are quite limited, right? Like 8,000 tokens versus 500,000 for some of the cloud models, right? So that can be really a significant consideration as well. What are they? They're not exactly words, but they're kind of words, but they're not words.
Yeah. So it's basically just a way to, quantify the amount of data that you're sending to your LLM. And so they also can be used to quantify the amount of data or text that your LLM is sending out as well. So you'll have like input tokens and output tokens. Generally, you can kind of equate them to characters. I think there's a little bit of like nuance there, but I think the simple explanation, that's good enough. And the value of such a wide, what we call like context window, is that the more context and direction your LLM has, the better it's going to perform. And so if you have those bigger windows, you can write more verbose instructions and just write more clear guidelines for your LLM to follow. You can also put more relevant context for if your system is answering questions. Maybe you need to provide just relevant context there. And we'll talk a little bit more down the line about the value of like memory and long-term storage in agentic applications. And so we'll often feed back in some of the important things logged in memory. And so if you have that bigger context window, you can send in more of that data as well. So that might be like user preferences or previous responses or that previous messages, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and if you run out of that space, then it's kind of as if the first part of the conversation, which might include important instructions like we are working on this project, here is our goal, would just kind of either drop off or it would be a runtime error or something. So yeah, it super matters.
Yep. And I think, I guess one other important note around tokens is that's often how you're charged for LLM use.
Yes,
if you are using more tokens on input and more tokens on output is a higher cost. But that higher cost is often worth the significant performance improvement.
It is. It definitely is. Yeah, so that's for the cloud usage-based ones, certainly that's what you get charged. And that's some of the appeal of the local ones. But the local ones, they can't answer the questions as well. They don't have as much data. Are there local models that do agentic stuff? Or would I do something like LangGraph, talking to I don't know, Mistral or something running, it's like a 7 billion parameter Mistral running locally. Would I use LangGraph to get that agentic behavior and things like that?
Yeah. So I think some of the, like one of the main features that we think about when we think about agentic behavior is that like tool calling ability. And so I think if a model doesn't have support for that, then its utility is more limited. But that being said, as long as the model can reason and provide guidance, then you can certainly kind of build an agentic application around it with LangGraph.
Okay. Yeah, very neat. All right, so my other question before we got distracted on this terminology thing, it was, why not just call the LLM directly? Like, what's wrong with that? Which I can think of a couple things, but lay it out for us.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing to think about is like controllability and reliability. So one of the main kind of hallmark features of LangGraph is this human in the loop support. So you can send a request to your LLM and then it's going to return a response. And maybe before you do anything with that response, you probably want to check that, maybe the tool call that it made is okay, or that whatever expensive or risky operation that is about to be run, you want to confirm that, or maybe edit the parameters or that sort of thing. And so I think for very, simple chat-based applications, just calling the LLM is okay. You can use LangChain to specify some of those model setting parameters easily, or, use different LLMs. But anytime you want to build something with just more reliability, I think you definitely want more of a framework around it that provides those kind of guardrails.
Sure. There's also things like persistence and durability, which if you've had a long, drawn-out conversation with these APIs, that can be a big deal, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I figure we'll probably chat a little bit more about both human in the loop and persistence. But one of the nice things about LangGraph is that we offer kind of short-term and long-term persistence. So you can have, persistence across just a conversation. So like kind of one thread of discussion or one application run, and then also across runs. So going back to the email assistant example, you probably want your email assistant to learn from your like long-term preferences rather than just your like, single human in the loop edit on one email that came in, for example.
Right. You might say, I know you flagged this to be forwarded over here, but when it looks like this, I think I need you to take that into account, and it means something different. You want it to know that forever.
Yep, exactly.
At the same time, people get freaked out. I think ChatGPT started identifying your name and addressing you by name without you saying what your name is, and it freaked people out. It's like, well, you've been giving it your secrets for 6 months,
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, yeah.
I think my equivalent of being a little freaked out by ChatGPT was I was asking it for some like birthday gift ideas for my partner, and it was like, oh, I think based on your previous commentary about your hobbies and things you like to do with your partner, then like here's some ideas. And I was like, wait a minute, I didn't tell you that today. Like I didn't mention that I like to run and go on hikes, but that like
it's spying on me. No, wait, I told it this over and over and over. But yeah, it's very interesting. Mostly useful, somewhat weird. All right, let's maybe talk through, to give people a sense how this might work. Let's maybe just talk through like a quick start example. I know talking about code, it's a bit troublesome on audio formats, but we'll just keep it like high level. But give us a sense of what is it like to write some code here. Maybe we could just talk through the quick start for LangGraph.
Yeah, that sounds great. If you don't mind, we actually just made a docs update. So I sent you a link with our new quick start that is much quicker. So it might be a little bit easier to understand.
Breaking news. Oh, it says I have to log in with Vercel.
Oh, okay. No worries.
Hold on. I'm just going to hack it real quick. Give me a second. No, just kidding. I don't know how to get to it.
Yeah, it's on our working preview branch.
Why don't you just talk? Why don't you just talk us through it on your side?
Yeah, sounds great. So our quick start is now kind of focused around creating a simple agent. So you can use that create React agent method that we talked about to create a weather agent. And so what that looks like is you call the function with your preferred model. So in this case, we're using Claude 3.7. And then we give it a get weather tool, or kind of, yeah, it just calls a weather API, maybe with the like city and state. And then you can provide it with a system prompt as well. So we give it some information about, you're a helpful assistant that specializes in weather forecasting and you have access to this get weather tool, and, just trying to provide it with helpful context to get it started.
Yeah, very cool. How much do you think that matters? That you kind of set the stage, like you're a helpful weather assistant or you're an expert in this field before I ask you questions.
Yeah, I think for a really simple application like just, providing one weather tool that has a great like description, I think it maybe doesn't matter quite as much. But I think as you, start to build out those like customer facing chatbots or the email agent that we've been discussing, I think the prompt and guidance becomes really important. And I think updating that with those memory stores like we've talked about helps your system be the most useful that it could be for you.
Yeah, that's true, because the long-term persistence probably serves a little bit of that role of like setting the context more deeply.
Yeah, definitely. So like just to give kind of an abbreviated example here, let's say my email assistant drafts me an email response and then I edit that and I, make it more concise and maybe a little bit more friendly or something like that. My agent, I can build in logic so that it updates the long-term memory store with that kind of guidance. And then the next time that the agent is called with an email stimulus, the prompt now has like keep things concise and a bit more friendly. And I didn't necessarily tell it that I wanted it to be shorter and more friendly. I just made that relevant edit and then it summarized that into the prompt. So all that being said, I think my analysis here would be that context and guidance is really, really important.
Yeah.
For this toy example, I think it would be okay without
Yeah, sure.
as much.
I do think one of the things that I would like to hear your thoughts on this as well and the guidance that you all give. But one of the things I think people who are new to LLMs in general, I think they kind of assume that it has too much knowledge or too much context. And you'll see like a one sentence, please analyze this document for me. Whereas if you gave it a 2-page write-up of the request you want, you might get dramatically better results. And I also think that that's where a lot of people say, oh, LLMs make mistakes and they do all these crazy things. It's like, well, you gave it so little information. What's it supposed to go on? And I guess in general, my comment is, I think people give way too short of prompts and background information to these things. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I'll send a link here to OpenAI just released a GPT 4.1 prompting guide. And if you like look at any of the guide, you'll see these like huge context blocks. And so obviously these guys, really know how these models work and are going to give us the best guidance. But I think.
Yeah, let me just give people listening a sense. It says a sample prompt for a software engineering benchmark verified. So here's a prompt you might get, and it says you'll be tasked to fix an issue in an open source repository, and then it doesn't even word wrap, but it still goes on, both
like
horizontally and vertically, hundreds of lines. Another thing that I think is super interesting is the use of Markdown when you talk to these things, because it can convey a little bit of like formatting, like, oh, this is a link, or this is bolded, so it means something different than if it's not bolded.
Yes. Yeah. It's really interesting kind of trying to play the game of how can I optimize my context so that I'm optimizing the behavior of the LLM. I think we talk a lot in when we're talking about LangGraph about like the structure of your application, but then really all that boils down to is like getting your context right, so that
Yeah.
your agent can do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the diversion. I do think to be successful with this stuff, you've really got to have your talking to LLMs game really strong, because that's the atomic units of this, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, back to the quick start. You give it a prompt.
Yes.
Maybe a long, good one.
Yeah. If you go on our docs, there should be like an agents section, and I think there's an so if you go to LangGraph and then up at the, let's see, oh yeah, the agents tab on the top,
What'd that do?
like the top nav if you go to
There we go.
agents. Yeah.
Got
So
it.
we should have a like getting started with agents section that's maybe a little bit more relevant for users. And oh yeah, there you go.
It doesn't want to. That is so bizarre.
Maybe the agents.
Oh, I think it's just in here. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Maybe.
So what that would look like, you have your create React agent, and then you can invoke it with a set of messages. So maybe I want to say, what's the weather like in San Francisco? And then it returns a response. And then you can invoke it again and say, like, what about New York, or other questions like that. And that's kind of the like out of the box, how do you build, just 10 lines of code, you've got an agent working for you with context and tools, etc.
Okay. Yeah. Super neat. So when is your new getting started tutorial walkthrough thing coming out?
Yeah, good question. So we have it coming out, I believe, at the end of the week. We have our Interrupt conference next week, so we want to like have our docs kind of revamped for that.
Interrupt. Okay. Is that like, because that's the call for human in the loop callback effectively, right? Is that the origin of that name?
Yes, yeah, it is. I think we're like really emphasizing kind of the value of that. I just sent you the link as well for that. It should be viewable publicly as kind of our old agents guide. But yeah.
Okay, cool.
Happy to talk more about human in the loop if that's helpful.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that sounds pretty interesting, right? We've got chat, which is obviously human in the loop, although when you press deep research, less in the loop. Then you've got these Python programs, which maybe just completely run on themselves, but yeah, what is this human in the loop, and how does that work?
Yeah, great question. So the human in the loop, we are trying to basically add human approval or edits for cases that are basically sensitive decisions that are being made. So very simple example, let's say you have a hotel booking agent and you get a request in that's like, I'd like to book a stay at whatever, Hilton in Boston. You might want a user to just kind of approve that sensitive, financial, like significant financial burden before the booking actually goes through. And so we make it really easy with this interrupt function anywhere in a tool or node to, say interrupt, I want to get human input here that can review tool calls, validate outputs from an LLM, or like augment, existing data or context, so that you can make sure your LLM is doing the right thing.
I see. It's like, well, we found these things. What would you like me to focus on? Or is it okay to make this call to this API? Maybe it's a paid API, like, oh, we're accessing this expensive stock data. But I think if I knew this, I could answer your question. You're like, yeah, spend the $1. Let's see, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Or like with the hotel booking agent, let's say I'm like, I'd like to book the Hilton in Boston. And then it comes up with a proposal for booking not the right hotel. I can say, like, actually, can you clarify with the user which hotel they'd like to book? Like maybe provide an address or something. And then that like cycles back through, and then maybe it gets the proper tool call the second time.
Right. They didn't mind driving, so we put them on the opposite end with the maximum traffic. It only looks like at 10 miles, but it actually turns out to be 2 hours to get from here to there when they need to be there.
Yep.
They don't want that, right?
Yep, definitely. One kind of exciting other open source project we have is called Agent Inbox. And so if you have a lot of interrupts, going in your application, the Agent Inbox, you can hook up to that application, and it basically provides you almost looking like this email inbox of all the interrupts for you to address.
Okay.
So maybe if you had like a social media agent or something that was helping you with your posts, and it, interrupted right before the final post, you can go through and like accept all those tool calls, or, edit posts right before they get sent out. Just making it easier to kind of deal with, multiple runs, things like that.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense, because otherwise, what are you going to just have a bunch of programs that are executing but just stuck there waiting for people until they go and just start typing back to it?
Right, exactly. And how human in the loop ties into this persistence layer, sort of twofold. One, an application can be suspended for any indefinite amount of time. So the guarantee with our persistence is that you can just restart back where the interrupt was, whether that's a minute later, 5 minutes later, 10 days later, a year later, whatever that may be. So just making sure that like you're guaranteed to get that human input before you resume, but then you have a kind of resumable state. The second thing is, like we've talked about, you want to learn from that human input. And so you can kind of analyze that in a separate step and then store that in the long-term memory.
Okay. And is that a coding thing that you do, or is that just the way you set up the workflow?
Yeah, great question. So we provide kind of support for the fundamentals in LangGraph, but we think kind of extensibility and customizability is pretty important. So we have like data structures for those short-term and long-term stores, but we also provide interfaces so that you could customize your store. And we have like in-memory stores or Postgres stores or things like that. But if you wanted to use some custom location, you could do that as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's super interesting. So with this ability to suspend these conversations, does that depend upon the LLM keeping that information around? Like, if you make a call to an API, do you get like a session ID sort of thing for that conversation? Or does it somehow store it, like you say, in Postgres or wherever, and then provide that back to the LLM to keep talking to it?
Yeah, so it's the latter of those. You're kind of storing the conversation state and message history and any other relevant state to your application. And then once you get that signal from the user, you can pick all that up. It's kind of unique to the thread. We call it like the thread ID or the run ID. And start back from there. Then you would, if you're going to call the LLM again, just feed in that context.
Right. Yeah, because that's kind of what subsequent chats are, right? It's see everything again, plus the new information, now answer that, right? It's a little weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful for things like local LLMs that might run or restart more frequently, unlike some of the cloud ones where they kind of keep that data. But I don't know how long they keep it for,
Yeah. Yeah, and then a new kind of exciting feature in the like persistence space generally is we're gonna very soon introduce caching on the kind of node by node level. So you can imagine if you have a node, which is really just a function running some expensive operation. For simplicity, we can just say it's like a pre-processing step, not even involved with an LLM. You pass certain inputs to that node, and you could enable some sort of cache policy there so that if you're starting up with the same inputs, you get to skip that step. And so really just trying to optimize for, how can lots of different types of users use this same low-level system for a variety of agentic workflows.
Yeah, nice. So you have these nodes and graphs, and then you put it together in this workflow, and you got this cool persistence of memory. Can some of those operations be just pure Python workflow type things rather than always LLM, right? Like, can it be call this LLM, use this tool, call this LLM? Now just make an entry in our database, or just send an email, or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the kind of value of that low level framework. Other, what we call agent frameworks are really just focusing on the um, operations involved with LLMs.
Right.
So
Or
like
orchestrating multiple LLM calls, more or less. Yeah.
right. So
Okay.
like the OpenAI Agents SDK, for example, helps you, you know, query OpenAI LLMs and orchestrate many agents together and maybe have guardrails, but there's no kind of built-in support for just those, standard Python operations, functions, processing, etc. And so Node really just can contain any function. So calling some API or doing any other thing you might possibly want it to do in just pure Python.
Yeah. So we talked about using different LLMs like Anthropic or OpenAI or a local one that you might download. Can I mix and match LLMs within a single workflow? Can I say
Yeah,
this part I want to run on a local model and that part I want to run on, O3 Pro or whatever? I
yeah,
don't know if that's even
definitely.
out on the API. It's certainly not out in chat, but where's O3 Pro? Come on.
Yeah, and they have O4 and 4.0 as well. So
Oh
um,
my gosh, it's even, yeah,
yeah,
it's,
but yeah, absolutely, you can mix and match as your heart desires. So LangChain, that like first open source tool that we have, makes it really easy to pass messages from one LLM provider to another in that kind of model agnostic format. And so if you're using LangChain's model abstractions from one node to the next, it's quite easy to
oh,
use.
that's cool. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really cool. And you could even do things, I imagine, such as I want to call a certain model that's really good at coding, maybe Claude 3.7 or something like that. But I
Right.
want to call, now I need to call another one that's better at tool usage and is more creative now that I have the answer, right? A little bit like my weirdo perplexity thing went and wrote Python code to answer my history question, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's really interesting to think about the pattern of using a model as a router. So you can imagine like a user asks a question and you give some model the context that's like, I have three model providers that I can use. Model provider A is really great at research. Model provider B is really good at solving coding problems, etc. And so first, the user question gets routed through that router node, and then that can send and basically delegate to one of the other nodes based on that model's like reasoning decision. So that is kind of a cool multi-agent architecture that you could
Yeah.
design with LangGraph pretty easily. One other thing that I wanted to note when you were asking about running Python code in nodes, kind of LLM or non-agentic patterns, is that we have this main graph API, which is what most folks use, but we've also introduced an imperative API that allows you to decorate functions with kind of two key things. One is an entry point decorator that's like, kind of indicative of the start node in your graph. And then another one is a task decorator. And so if you already have kind of a workflow like system or functions already written, you can easily turn that into a LangGraph workflow just with a couple of decorators, which is very nice.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah. I like it. I like it a lot. Um, let's talk about it, just if we look inside of LangGraph, surely it's written in Rust, right? That has to be written in Rust.
Yeah, still in Python, but
That's
yeah.
awesome. No, I think it's great that, you know, the library itself is written in Python, so it's easy to understand. Do you all have external contributors and take pull requests and stuff like that?
Yeah, we do. I think we see a bit more engagement on the LangChain side because LangChain itself is more involved with, new features released by model providers or things like that. We see more activity there, and LangChain is where all of our integrations lie. So, like the LangChain OpenAI package or LangChain Anthropic. So that's where most of the
Yeah.
community engagement is. But like any other good open source project, we've got open issues and discussions and a Slack help channel
Nice.
for LangGraph users as well.
Right, a community. Okay, cool. Well, I was going to say you had 174 contributors in LangGraph, but I thought that was pretty good in terms of number of people. But you've got 3,600 in LangChain, so yeah, that's pretty wild. Used by
Yeah.
237,000 projects.
Yeah, it is really impressive, kind of the scope of usage there. I think it's the biggest like developer community in the AI space. So it's really nice to have so many eager contributors and get to use that as kind of the foundation for the more model-driven operations in LangGraph.
Yeah, I always like to use the Python web frameworks as measuring sticks or whatever for these things. So, for example, if you look at search for Flask on GitHub, right? It's, where are you, Flask? Come here. It's got 70,000 stars, which is pretty awesome. You guys have 107, like just to give people a sense of like how popular this is. And I also bring this up because there are people out there go, oh, I can't believe you're doing an AI topic. I'm so tired of AI. I can't take any more AI, which I get on one hand. Like on the other, this is how significant it is. It's like literally revolutionizing tech and non-tech before our eyes. It's like history in the making, you know. It's like the invention of the web a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I understand kind of the, things are so novel, and I understand wanting to push back against such big change. But I think one of the reasons that I like LangGraph as a tool so much is that it really lets you balance the, AI when you need it and not when you don't. We talk a lot about kind of finding yourself on this like workflow versus agents curve. The more like pure agent is much less predictable, and pure workflow is predictable, but maybe not quite as useful. And I think it lets you pick like wherever you want to be on that curve. And so hopefully that's also relevant for listeners who are like, man, I'm not, super interested in AI applications, but like maybe I have this one huge workflow where one step could really use the help of an LLM. And so I think it's a nice like on ramp into AI usage for developers. And just the customizability is very valuable. But yeah, I mean, I understand like the general hesitation. I think it's kind of revolutionizing our industry, and it's unpredictable. So
Yeah, I agree. One other thing I'd like to throw out there is, I think rightly so, a lot of people are concerned about the environmental impacts of heavy AI usage. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do with local models, and the local models really don't make any difference running them, not necessarily training them. Like, for example, I was running a 7 billion parameter model for this Git project that I'm doing and this Git tool. And I think I have a little iStats menu thing for my my computer's energy usage. Right now it's using between 30, so it's 13 watts, but it bumps around like 13, 14 watts. When the LLM was running, it jumped all the way up to 20, which is like one LED light bulb for 4 seconds, right? So
yeah,
if people who are concerned about those things, like you can run these models locally and still get a huge amount of benefit, even if you don't get like the full deep research, massive type of stuff you get from the cloud. It's still really, really impactful, I think.
yeah, definitely. I think that like really leans into the idea of like build simple when you can. Like a lot of these systems can be relatively simple, and context windows are widening, and I think if you can construct a solution that just meets your needs but doesn't do anything like crazy outside of it, it's both going to be better environmentally and like more reliable of a system.
Yeah, I was talking to Ines Montani about this whole topic, but mostly about the open source, or at least open weights models and things like that. And one of the things she really focused on was about task-specific models, or models that are really focused on solving a certain problem. And it sounds to me like combining that idea with LangGraph and sort of bringing in multiple models to the model router, I think you called it, could be really cool. So instead of running huge models, I run 5 small ones, but in coordination, they actually become very powerful.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the challenges of using LLMs is like reliability if tasks are ambiguous, right? Like it's not going to do a good job if you don't tell it what you want it to do. And so, yeah, if you have these really specialized tools and you only route things to, or I say tools, what I really mean is models, to clarify when tools is also overloaded. But yeah, if you have very specialized models and you can kind of properly route queries and questions and tasks and demands to them, I think that's the best way to um, have a reliable system.
Yeah, it's probably faster too.
Yeah, yeah, and lower environmental footprints.
The one bonus, the one good thing I think here is that the negative environmental impact is directly correlated with cost. So people's incentives are aligned for trending towards less environmental impact, even if they don't care about it, right? They just want to save money. That's still going to get kind of the same output.
Definitely. I think I'm actually really excited. I won't be able to go to PyCon this year, but I'm excited to watch some of the talks after the fact. And I help kind of review the talk submissions this year. And it seems like there's some really great ones focusing on environmental impacts of your Python code and how to reduce those and, you know, how to think about that on an individual versus like large scale. And I think it's really great that that's kind of driving more public conversation now.
Yeah, yeah. Don't tell your LLM thanks at the end. Come on.
Yeah.
So let's wrap this up with maybe a bit of a showcase. If you got some example apps or things you've seen build or things people are doing that you're like, this is really cool stuff you can do with LangGraph and LangChain or LLMs in general. Like what's some cool stuff you've seen out there people building?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I mentioned the email assistant as a very like simple one that I think is satisfying just in that the utility is really high and that's saving folks a lot of time. I think the social media agent is a cool idea if you're like, I don't want to spend a bunch of time, working on social media engagement, but I do want to kind of keep up with the most important updates in my space, and then also, kind of contribute. I think hopefully I'll have some better answers in the short term. Still kind of onboarding at LangChain and trying to better understand customer use cases.
Yeah, very cool. One of the things that I think, just thinking out loud of the examples of things that'd be really amazing is you look at research labs and academia in general, especially the research heavy ones, like how much those folks have to read long detailed papers and assess whether they even make any sense. You could set up some kind of agentic workflow that just watches for new things being published in your field, looks to summarize them, determines the impact and relevance, and then brings you like a digest, a weekly digest. Well, here's what's happened in academia for you. And would you do have other questions? That could be like your interrupt or your inbox sort of thing. Like, well, which of these would you like us to dive into, right? And like maybe, really go in and analyze these further. And I don't know. It seems like when you're really trying to summarize text or process it or correlate it, I don't know. There's so many possibilities there.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really cool to think about how extensible that is. You could kind of build this like general system for a research agent that's going to provide you with a summary. And then different users can be like, okay, here are the 3 topics that I'm most interested in, like provide me with the summary for those, Nice to basically think about like individual users specifying things that they want to narrow in on or like specialties that they want to emphasize.
Yeah. Super, super fun. All right. How about a last thing here, a roadmap? Where are things going? What should people maybe been asking for that might be showing up they should be on the lookout for?
Yeah. So one thing I mentioned a little bit earlier is that kind of node level cache. I think that'll just be a nice performance boost for folks, especially folks looking to, really scale with their LangGraph applications. The thing that we're focusing on the most now is kind of this happy path for those pre-built. So the like create agent functions, or some other frameworks have classes. I think, for example, with human in the loop, I'm working on a feature right now that makes it really easy to use kind of default patterns for human in the loop with those pre-built agents. So maybe you have like tools A, B, and C, and for all of them, you want default logic such that, when the tools run, a human has to accept the tool call before, or when the tools are recommended by an LLM before the tool actually runs. So basically, just emphasizing really making it easier to get started with those like create agent pre-builts, because we think there's going to be increasing demand on the like, how do I in 10 lines of code get started with a really functional agent.
Yeah. Oh, this is very Pythonic, right? Like it has a lot of, you can do all the things with it if you want, but then you're down in the details and you're doing advanced programming type stuff, right? But what's the import library, do the few things, have magic happen, right?
Yep, definitely. I think those like quick start guides are great if they're truly quick. And so I think just kind of shooting for that on our end.
Yeah, that's cool. I would also, this is pure speculation, but maybe informed speculation, I don't know. If I were to guess, people coming to do web stuff in Python are pretty CS like folks, maybe not pure, like they don't necessarily have CS degrees, but they've got that way of thinking. Like they know what a unit test is, even if they don't do them. They know about SQL, even if they use an ORM or whatever. And then we've got the data science folks where before the AI revolution, that was like, well, this is where people who are not really programmers sort of get their first step into Python, and then they kind of get hooked, but they start by doing these real simple things like the projects you're talking about or the features you're talking about. And then they realize, oh, well, I can do a little more. And then they sort of work their way backwards into becoming Python programmers. I would say that people come into AI are maybe even less formal than the data science folks, right? It's a little even further along that spectrum there. And so really making those people feel welcome until they become a little more programmer focused is probably really important.
Yeah, I recall you chatted on your kind of developer trends for 2025 forecast podcast about the value of being able to get started in Python if you've never written a single line of code, and it being pretty easy. And then, also folks like the, or teams like the folks at Astral developing tools for, really advanced users and people who really want to make Python a sophisticated system. And I think we basically with LangGraph want to provide that same benefit of you can get started with a couple lines of code, and then also like you want to deploy, tons of parallel instances running parallel processes and streaming responses with all of these features, like you can do that too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you start with one, grow to the other if that's the path you're on, right?
Yep. And I guess one other thing that I'll mention roadmap wise is both LangChain and LangGraph integrate with LangSmith, which is our kind of commercial product. And we didn't talk a ton about observability and more of the like prompt engineering or evaluation side of things that is often tied into agentic workflows. But so if you're building applications with LangGraph, using LangSmith for observability can be super valuable, especially when you're at scale.
Okay. Yeah, monitoring for AI app performance, super cool. I guess maybe one more is it LangChain Studio or Lang Studio, the studio for debugging?
Yeah, so if you're developing your LangGraph application, you can just run LangGraph dev in your terminal, and then that pops up with kind of a local studio, and you can like step through your graph. That's a great screenshot there, or GIF, I guess. But that makes it really easy to debug things locally and just kind of understand the flow of your system in real time. And then we also offer LangGraph platform where you can do this kind of thing as well, but deployed instead locally.
Okay. Awesome. Well, final call to action. people are interested in getting started with all these ideas, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I would say look forward to our new docs drop this week. I think it's going to really emphasize helping folks get started with those create agent pre-builts.
Can they
And
just go to langchain.com and click on docs and go from there?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So we have our LangChain docs there, our LangGraph docs there, and it should be quite easy to get started. And obviously, I mentioned our kind of community forums earlier, but we have a community help Slack and open issues and discussions, etc. So feel free to ask questions there.
And then this Interrupt conference you talked about, is this going to be live streamed or recorded and videos available?
Yes, yeah, we should have talk recordings and demo recordings available as well. One other resource that I should mention is that we are kind of trying to grow in the education space. And so we also offer a LangGraph course, and we'll be releasing a new course next week, kind of focusing on those ambient agents. And that's a really great way to get started if you're maybe not quite ready to write code, but just kind of want to learn more about the LangGraph features, or if you are ready to write code, it has some awesome resources and notebooks as well.
Awesome. Well, very interesting, and it's an exciting time to be working in code. It's changing fast.
Yeah, definitely. It's great to talk about these cool new systems that we get to use and explore.
Yeah, well, looking forward to seeing what you all keep creating. Thanks for being back on the show, Sydney.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, bye.